Okay, I'm going to assume we're live now. StreamYards is always so slow in letting me know these things, but hello everybody, Joanna here, and welcome to Why Read, episode 12. And I'm joined here by Overly Average Ben and Grace Dionne. So hello, so wonderful to have you two.
It's so wonderful to be here. I was really excited when you asked us if we wanted to do this.
Yay. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, same.
I was really excited when you asked us if we wanted to
Does somebody have another window open maybe with their
I don't believe so.
Yeah, same.
I wonder how that's happening because I know I don't have any other windows open.
No, I don't
Well,
either.
it's very strange.
I think it might be coming from Ben, but I'm not sure how.
I think so. I've stopped it now. I don't know whether that was me.
Are we okay?
Yeah,
Let us know in the
I don't
chat.
hear it anymore. So
Yeah, let's see.
I apologize if it was me.
Did we go live? By the way, is our because StreamYard is not. We are live. Okay, just double check.
I believe so.
Adam has commented hello, so I assume that means that he.
Okay, yeah. Please let us know because on StreamYard on my end, it's showing me that I need to press go live again, which is weird. Oh, now it's showing I'm live. Thank you for letting us know, Paul and Adam. Yeah, sorry for the weird technical difficulties here. The StreamYard was it was showing me that I needed to press go live again. I'm like, what? Okay.
Pretty sure I did
All
that.
Right. Yeah, I'm like, I did that. Okay. So here we are. So thank you for joining us if you're here in the chat. And we're going to go ahead and just start with our typical question, which is why read? I love this question. I think it's an important one for various reasons. And I think I'm going to start first. I'll start with Grace first. So, Grace, what motivates you to pick up a book? You have a very busy life, as you were mentioning before we went live. What motivates you to pick up a book right now with your busy schedule, with everything going on? What is it that's drawing you to picking up books?
Well, I feel like obviously we've got like an hour or 2 hours to answer this question overall, but it's a hard question to sum up. But I think that what it comes down to for me is that there are kind of two factors. One of them, and this one might be surprising to some people, is that I feel like I actually have a better attention span for reading than I have for most things. And I know that a lot of people tend to feel the opposite. Like if they're trying to get into reading, they say like, oh, I can't focus on it. I don't have the attention span for it. But for me, I feel like even if I'm watching YouTube or if I'm like watching a TV show or something, I'm always like on my phone or I'm like reaching for something else or I need like other stimulus. But if I'm reading a book, I feel like it's an active enough activity for me that it's one of the things I can like immerse myself the most in and just like be in it and enjoy it. And then the other kind of side of my answer is that I love like, I guess you could call it learning and the constant ability to experience like characters that are like nothing like me or like people who are fictional obviously but like constantly expand like my perspectives and boundaries by being like so different and exposing me to like emotions and perspectives and life experiences that like I've never had. And I feel like that it's something that I see in a lot of booktubers is kind of like compassion and understanding. And like a lot of us that read fiction, I feel like have that. It's almost like inherent in when you like stuff your brain with a bunch of different like walks of life. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's a huge thing for me, which fits into like immersion and escapism, but is a very specific part of it that I enjoy.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm always wondering that too, because you were mentioning that does seem to be a commonality among a lot of people who are readers. And I wonder if reading books cultivates that, or if people cultivate that ability to be more compassionate or empathetic through reading, or if people are already naturally empathetic and compassionate and curious about people, as you mentioned, your curiosity about reading about other types of people also draws you to reading. And then that just happens to coincide with that. So I'm always curious about that topic, but I love that answer. So thank you. Yeah. What about you, Ben?
Why does any addict do what they do? It's I think it's become a compulsion at this point. I think I moved away from reading for a long time, and then I came back, and I think the reason is that I think I really appreciate that whilst it's an art form that has a lot of people involved, like editors, proofreaders, beta readers, etc., etc. It comes down to like a single person's vision, and it feels like you're seeing someone's perspective and point of view. Whereas a lot of different mediums now, like I used to love films and TV, whereas now when I watch it, I feel like there's just a muddying involved in a lot. So I find it hard to immerse myself, and I find myself commenting more on different forms of media. Um, Whereas reading, I can read it and just kind of just feel content, and not like I am like being overly critical or bringing in real world connotations. I do bring in real world connotations a lot with reading, but like not a cynical edge. I think a lot with when I watch TV or film, and then I also feel like there's a sense of that I appreciate that with writing, it's possibly the most free, but also in both senses, most freeing form of art, but also the most free to create. All you need to create that form of art is an imagination and a way to write it down. You don't need to buy different forms of paint or canvas or like different types of things to make your stuff look better. You don't need an editing software, or it's just it's something that anyone can create, and for that reason I think it's the most liberating form. And so I feel like I just appreciate the art a lot in terms of like reading in particular.
Yeah. I'm curious though. So are you a writer as well?
Be very speculative in that regard. I like to write. I don't believe I'm very good at it or anything, but um, I like to express myself that way, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
But you know,
You're
I would not consider myself that.
Yeah. Yeah. But I get what you're saying too, though. If you want to be creative with being a writer, you could just pick up a pencil and paper. You don't really need to have a lot of equipment. But that's an interesting comment, Liam, about literacy ain't always cheap. I'm curious more about that.
definitely why
um,
libraries are so important to a lot of people.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I honestly, like, for a long time, I was all about the library. I spent a couple of years not really buying any books, or maybe just like 1 or 2 a year. The sad part though is I moved, and so I'm not as close to a library anymore, and I never realized, oh man, I don't know. I just it's interesting how I never thought about how that could impact that as well. You know, we think of reading as like, oh, just go to the library, but man, it's like a journey now, and gas is kind of high.
Yeah.
That's the
The
only
I
problem
thing.
think
I
it's
have with going to the library is that, and the library that I have like a membership with actually has a great fantasy selection. Like I was really impressed the first time I went there. But whenever I go there and look at library books, I'm looking at the shelves being like, am I really going to sign out this library book when I have like 150 books on my shelves at home staring at me that I need to read?
If you're a book collector, for sure. Yeah, yeah. I used to go to bookstores all the time though, and I just wouldn't know what to pick up. And I always thought, oh, books are so expensive, and I don't know if I'll like this book or not. And I would get so scared about buying a book and then not liking it. And now I never have the problem of not knowing what to pick up anymore because of
yeah.
BookTube.
Yeah, it
So
totally changed the game because, well, Ben mentioned like going away from reading for a while and then coming back to it. And I did the same thing because during my undergraduate degree, I read during the summers, but like during my actual classes and the school year, I didn't really have time to read for pleasure at all because I was reading enough like as it was, and just life was busy and everything. And so I would be so mentally exhausted. Like I watched a lot more TV during my undergrad than anything else because I'd be so mentally exhausted that I would just like lay in bed and do that and not have to think. But when I came back to it, was kind of maybe a year before I discovered BookTube, so I had a year of kind of, like, groping in the dark, finding my way of, like, what I wanted to read. I reread Game of Thrones in that time, though, um,
Yay.
and then, found BookTube, and ever since then, I have, like, literally just not stopped buying books, so
I was gonna
I
ask you too also about that. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, I was gonna say that I think I'm lucky that, I think I'm lucky that I don't care what books look like, and so,
Mm.
my addiction is purely going to secondhand bookstores and just, like, rifling around for and I can come away from, like, an afternoons of book shopping and have spent less than a cup of coffee, and I just, I live for books that are disgusting, and I think that that makes it a very viable, cheap option compared to like the idea of special editions and stuff. They go past me compared to some aged, decrepit edition.
Like books to have character, to
Yeah,
feel lived in. Yeah. There's something about that for sure. There's an appeal there. I could see that. It's almost like its own kind of aesthetic in a way, I
yeah.
would say. But I was curious about that because you both are so busy, and I imagine Grace, you being a scientist, are probably have to read quite a few papers for your work, and then Ben, you're obviously reading a lot for your studies. Um, so that doesn't seem to interfere with your focus on reading, because I know that you were just saying, Grace, that like when you were a student, the cognitive load that you put
Yeah.
into so much of your studies, I think that was also why I didn't read as much fiction back then, because it was just I was tired mentally,
Yeah.
but I wanted to, but it was just there was a time factor.
Well, for me now, like, for my work, I don't have to read nearly as much, like, I don't know if you call it, like, educational material as I did have to in school. Now it's kind of like, I've been trained on a lot of the major things that I need to be trained on, so at this point, it's kind of like I can dive into, like, as much additional learning as I want to, but I don't necessarily have to, so I feel like I kind of try and, like, break it up, and there's a lot of time usually at the end of the day at work to do that type of thing, like, if I if I want to, and we have, like, online modules and stuff that, come up every year or 18 months or whatever that we have to do, and just to make sure that we're all, like, refreshed on, well, the chemistry, I guess, and everything else really, like radiation protection and everything, so that type of stuff is so much more manageable now, than it was in school.
Ah, that's great. What about you, Ben?
I I try to be very strict with myself in the sense of like if I know I have to read, like I have to read this many journal articles and this chapter of a book for like for research and that type of thing, then I balance it with like if I read this much of the stuff I actually want, then I've given myself that, so now I have to do this work, and I use it as a way to like check and balance myself, which has worked well so far. Because when you're a student, there are too many hours in the day to begin with. So like I think I was glad like there sometimes you just sit there and you're like,
Oh.
what am I doing right now? It's I've got 2 hours between a lecture. I don't know what I'm
Oh, yeah,
doing.
for
I
sure.
don't want to do any research. Life is just fleeting past, and you're like, you know what? I'll read a book for 2 hours, and like that's how it works for me. Where yeah, I check and balance myself is how I try to do it. Is as long as I'm doing the work I need to be doing, then I can read as a little bit of fun because there's nothing worse than just reading dry, just the like 150-year-old discussions on the Bronte sisters, and you just like, I want to read some, I want to I want to read some new stuff, please. And so yeah, I try to keep it a balance.
You'd rather read
Mm.
the Bronte sisters than read an 150-year-old discussion about the Bronte sisters.
Absolutely, I don't care what Annie thought about Wuthering Heights. It was a sister's work; she could deal with it.
That is so funny. That's awesome. And so I'm curious about what Philip was saying here in the chat earlier. He said that he wonders what percentage of booktubers are writers or aspiring writers. I must be one of the 10% who doesn't fall into that equation. I think
Yeah,
maybe at one point in
so
time when I was
good.
like, yeah, at one point in time, I think when I was a kid and I first fell in love with reading, I did have the dream of like, I want to be a fictional writer someday. And at some point along my journey, that just died. And now I just like have no desire to be a writer at all. Like none. I am fascinated by it. I'm fascinated learning about writing and like what inspires people to write and the process involved and like different forms of narratology and all of that. But I have no interest in being a writer. I just love reading. What about
Yeah.
you two?
That's basically the same with me. Like I took a creative writing course in university and I kind of had fun with it just as an experience, but I've never really had the aspiration to be a writer either. And I think part of it comes down to, and this is kind of funny, that like even when I love a book and it's one of my all-time favorites, I can't always necessarily tell you like why, or like in a nuts and bolts sense, like breaking it down, I'm like I don't know what went into this equation. Like how would I reverse engineer and even like find out how to write well or things that are good. But also I don't really have the drive to do that either. Like I imagine that if that was something that you really wanted to do, you'd be thinking about that all the time with every book and figuring out like what it is that makes it tick. But um I'm like you, Joanna, like I love reading other people's works so much, and I don't have the desire to do it.
Yeah.
I
Ben's
think
like, I do.
well,
Yeah.
mine is like before starting uni, I was like, I definitely, I want to be a writer so bad. And then when you're at uni and you're like, everything you're doing every day is deconstructing and criticizing or pointing out the positives, and you're learning all these different techniques and everything. Like the more I learn, the more I think about like I don't understand the fundamentals of how to make a what I would deem like a perfect story. That it's hard to get yourself in the mind frame of just getting stuff down to separate it. Like I think Phillips just said, like separating that reader and writer brain, where it's like when you look at when you look at books that I don't even necessarily love, and I look at it, and I'm like, this is so well written. Like The Handmaid's Tale. I think like The Handmaid's Tale is a great book. It's not my favorite, but like even looking at the first page, and you look at the idea of the like how she uses metaphors to talk about the past, and then like the fact that like the way there's the allusions to the past and this dystopian world and the way it's set up and everything. Like I just think about the techniques that go into making a piece of writing that I would want to make, and I'm like, I don't have the skill or the time at the moment to put myself through that. um so that's where I come down. I'm like, the most I write is, and Grace can attest to this because I send them to her, because she's very good at editing. Is I just send her like little short stories I've written for something at uni, or like an article I've written for the uni paper or something. I just do stuff like that. Um,
We
Yeah.
can
I
be
love
more separate
that.
in his
That's
way.
cool. Yeah.
yeah,
But you've also written really good skits. Like you were doing that for a while too. I
yeah,
think too.
yeah. That went away. I haven't done a skit in a long time.
They were so
it's
funny though.
yeah.
And I was like,
I
that
think
takes some good writing too. And humor is hard. I feel like you have a skill for that too.
You
that's
I
definitely
would.
the
do.
only thing I've ever actually written is a novella that was like a comedic novella. And that wasn't even fantasy, that was set in the real world. But that was very clear COVID brain writing, like during the COVID era of just you're separated from society and you're just writing this weird thing. Like I look back on it, I'm like, that is horrendous.
Yeah. Aw. No, I was watching this one channel for a while. I watch her channel sometimes. This channel name is Christiane Jones, and she reads a lot of she does reading and writing on her channel, like a lot of magical realism. She loves Neil Gaiman, for example. And she does this project, and I know she's not the only one. I've seen this on other channels too, where she does these like specific vlogs of writing in the style of Neil Gaiman, or writing in the style of not the style, but like the sorry, not the style, but the approach to writing as Sanderson or Neil Gaiman or I think she did a Murakami one once as
I
well.
think
So
Murakami's always the go-to one because he's so wild.
yeah. But it's like a very specific, like, what is their process for writing? So she researches that, like what they do. Like Sanderson has a very strict schedule of when he writes throughout the day and what intervals he doesn't write and how he writes. And so she did that for like, she does experimental vlogs like that. And one of my favorite ones I saw was her Neil Gaiman one because she did this one with Neil Gaiman. And what she did with that Neil Gaiman does is that apparently Neil Gaiman in this vlog, if I got this right, she was saying that he has this like beautiful outdoor space that he goes to and that he has two rules for himself. He can sit in this beautiful space and do absolutely nothing, just sit there and do nothing. And he has total permission to do that, or he can write. And it said, turns out writing is a little more interesting than doing nothing. And I don't know why, but that appealed to me so much. So I've tried to do that a little bit with my reading. I'm like, I could absolutely do nothing right now if it's like a Saturday or, when I have some space, or I could read and I can't do anything else. Like, what am I going to read? Or whatever creative project I want to do. Like, I just love that. I like that idea of like trying an experiment like that.
That
So
is really cool. Isn't
yeah.
Murakami the one that like gets up at 5 in the morning and goes for a 10K run
Yes, I think that
every day?
sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I
Yeah.
came up with that idea as soon as I got to him, I would be like, "Well, we're not doing you."
Yes, that one.
'Cause I
Yeah,
wanna
I think that she did that too. I think she got up well, I don't know if she ran, but I think I'm pretty sure she did that one, or somebody did that one anyway.
He doesn't
I mean, I
I
wouldn't
think
fault her for, like, just running around the block or something.
yeah,
Yeah,
because he does,
no.
like, long I think it's, like, 4 hours of like, running on and off or something, like,
What?
he does 4 hours of exercise every day and then writes, and I think he's asleep by, like, 7 in the evening or something. Like, he lives a wild existence.
Crazy.
I could see there being something to that though, because not quite that long of a run, but I used to be a big time runner. I don't run as much anymore. I mostly walk, but when I was running a lot, like every day, miles and miles a day, I'd go for like these 7-mile runs or whatever. And then afterwards I would take a shower. And it was always when I was in the shower after a run that all these creative ideas would just flow into my brain like crazy. So I feel like there's got to be something to that.
Must work for him, like
And also being, like, magical realism is, like, you're kind of in that headspace where you're a little foggy from exhaustion, and, like, that's where the weird stuff comes in.
the
That's where he's
worlds
like
just start flooding in.
yeah. He's like,
Yeah.
"What if all the women were metaphors for his wife?" And it's like, that's where it all comes from. It's just random running.
That sounds like Murakami. I've only read one Murakami. I've read the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles, that book, or Chronicle. It's one
That's
S.
what I've read
No
as
S.
well.
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, you love that book.
I did love that book. That's one of the first books I read on my channel, so I feel like if I revisit it, I may feel very differently, but at the time, I was just, I was enthralled by the writing. Like, the writing was crazy. I, of course, have problems with that book in terms of, his depictions of women and that type of thing. They're very blatantly not right, but the actual just the writing style. I need to read more of him. There's just I don't know. Because of that fact that the way he writes women, that there's sometimes just a bit of like, oh, I'll pick up someone else because I'm not sure I'm in the mind frame to deal with that at the moment. But
Yeah.
Is he gonna have to go on the shame shelf whenever we, like, amalgamate our book collections so that nobody knows?
that's exactly it.
Got a shame shelf going on. That's so funny.
Well,
Yeah.
it's a running joke between us because of the fact that I'm a very, like, aesthetic focused, like, if I love a book and I own it in a copy that I don't like, I will buy the copy that I do like in order to display it. Like, obviously, I don't buy books just for the display, like, I still have to like them, but once I know I do and they're going on my shelf, I have to like the way they look. And so Ben is obviously the exact opposite of that. So we're gonna give him, like, a space in the basement or something.
Yeah,
That is
I'm
so
hidden.
funny. Aw. Yeah, that's
The
so
lucky thing is that because we read a lot of the same stuff, we don't need my copies. So we don't have to. It's my weird literary stuff that I'm bringing over that we have to worry about.
Well, you own a lot of, like, completely normal looking books. It's just that sometimes you get, like, something from a secondhand bookshop that has, like, the cover falling off that looks like it, like, fell in the mud at some point, but, like, I
I'm looking for examples around me at the moment to see whether I've got any.
Yeah. By the way, I have to say for those who are writers here in the chat or in general, I greatly admire those of you who are writers who are committed to that. And I also admire the fact that many of you obviously are probably readers as well, because I have known a couple of aspiring writers before who didn't read very much. It seemed like they read a lot in the past, but then once they started writing, they didn't read as much. And I think there was like this fear of ideas intervening in their stories, that kind of thing. So I totally respect that.
Yeah, I think is it Joe Abercrombie that says he only reads non-fiction while he writes, because he doesn't want that someone else's voice in his head type thing, which definitely makes sense. But I was going to say, for some reason, you saying about the idea of a writer that doesn't read, it made me think of, and I think Grace will know what I'm going to say, is there's a character called Garth Marenghi who's famous for he's like a terrible writer, and his famous line is, "I'm one of the few authors that has written more books than I've read." And he's like a fake Stephen King ripoff that's a comedy character.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, I could definitely understand the concept of not reading fiction while you're writing, but I feel like in order to, obviously everyone's process is different, but like, what if you decide to stop reading fiction and then somebody has like written the idea, or like at least like a few similar ideas into a book, and you're just like publishing your thing and everybody's like, you ripped this thing off, and you're like, oh well, I wasn't reading anything, so how would I know?
I won't call anybody out, but I do know of a book that I read where the person was not reading a lot, and there were other books very similar to that were published around that time frame, and I did wonder about that. I'll just say that. Yeah.
I feel like that could so easily happen, because like you could get something that you like tangentially heard about like stuck in your brain and not know, like after a while you develop it not knowing that it like wasn't your idea.
Yeah. And I know that Stephen King is known for saying that he is a big believer in being a reader if you're a writer. And Stephen King is somebody who like wears his influences on his sleeve. Like in his books, he will just make a nod or reference to basically everything that inspires him. Just no holds barred.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably the best way to do it if you're doing like a somewhat overt inspiration, because then nobody can kind of like accuse you of not knowing or not like giving homage to that thing. And
Yeah.
Or do it just incredibly well. Like, because like Stephen King, because I read Elmore Leonard for the first time and I was like, man, this reads a lot like Stephen King. It's because Stephen King was a massive Elmore Leonard fan and they write very similarly.
Is that
but
The Man in the Bad, or
no, that was the yeah, I forgot what it was called.
Is it the one that I just said?
Wait, what was it?
40 Lashes Less One.
That is the one. Yeah, they read so similarly, but Stephen King's such a good writer that it doesn't matter that they're similar writing styles. That I think, yeah, you can definitely get away with that, as long as you have the confidence and the skill to pull it off. Or like Hobb having a lot of Ursula K. Le Guin allusions between the two, and like references and similar ideas to some of the things in Earthsea, that I think, as long as you expand on those like inspirations, it can be like one of the biggest positives to your work, is where someone reads it and goes, "Whoa, this is giving me big this person vibes."
It's actually such a good point, because like if you're a good enough writer and you have like completely your own voice, then it's gonna feel distinct and unique in like your own book, no matter what. Like I feel like I mean you can't like completely rip something off, but like somebody like Hobb is just such a phenomenal writer that like, I don't know, her books are gonna feel like her books no matter what.
Yeah, and it's like the difference as well of like Le Guin having Earthsea be so short, and then you've got Hobb that's like, oh, I'm writing these massive
Mhm.
character focused, like really enthralling, like very slow moving plots. It's like they're so separate in how they're approaching it that if they have a through line, it you just appreciate them more rather than thinking it as a detriment. Um,
I totally agree with you, Grace. I think that like the authorial voice is probably the most unique feature an author can bring to a story, more so than the concepts that they're writing about. And I was curious for both of you actually about because we were just talking about magical realism. I was having this thought, and I know there's like a whole genre definition of what magical realism is, and there are specific, I think there are specific books that it's rooted down to. You know, there's a lot to say about that topic, so I don't mean to uh, oversimplify it too much, but I was thinking about this because I know there are various discussions about tropes in fantasy.
Mhm.
And I think, like, in the fantasy genre, I want to say we are a genre that, or we who love this genre are people who embrace those tropes. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something that we all gravitate towards, even if it's like subverting the trope, we're still embracing the trope on some level. And if, like, I don't know. So I don't really understand it if people I can understand people getting maybe tired of certain tropes if they feel like they're done a lot and not done in different ways. Maybe I can see that, an argument for that to some degree. But when I was thinking about it, I'm like, if you tried to write a fantasy book with no tropes, wouldn't that be just magical realism? If it were fantasy but with no tropes? That was a thought that I had the other day.
Well, magical realism is like by definition real world, right? So I guess it depends if you do secondary world or not, but then if you do create a secondary world, I feel like it's almost impossible not to have tropes because like you're going to be building based on I don't know, I like you gotta draw from somewhere. It's interesting what you said about, like, fantasy readers embracing tropes and everything because I completely agree with that, and I think that, like, I can enjoy pretty much any trope when it's written well, so I think what it comes down to is, like, I don't dislike tropes at all. I think the only times when I would, like, I guess you could call it dislike them is when that, like, authorial voice doesn't come into it, like, if you feel like you're reading something that doesn't add any extra flavor to them for you personally, then it kind of just feels like you're reading a lineup of tropes, if that makes sense. Like a
Mm.
story that just kind of progresses through like maybe treads paths that you've seen before. And then if it doesn't have something like a spark that makes it unique for you or for me, then that's where it might like fall apart. But then that comes down to personal taste. So you can't even say that objectively necessarily about a series because there could still be people that love it.
yeah, I feel like it's like what's the word? Where what is the word? It's whether how you approach it. Whether like some people approach tropes cynically, where they're like, "Well, I know people like this, so I'm going to pop this in here," or like, "Oh, I know this person did it and that was popular, so I'll pop it in." Or it's just the story that you want to tell. I think like if you approach it from a refreshing point of view, then anything it's the very basis of like storytelling is to have these tropes. But if you approach it cynically and you're just like I'm just going to slap that in here because people like an underdog, etc. Then it's like, oh,
I
um,
agree with you.
yeah,
No, I agree with you. I think that's where I don't really I feel a little unsure when I see those videos that are like writing advice for fantasy writers, and they're like, you have to subvert the tropes and you have to make your villains nuanced. And I'm like, no, that's formulaic. Like, if it's genuine to your idea, like if that's genuine to the story that you feel that you're wanting to tell, then that I think that's wonderful. But if you're doing it because like you're trying to throw it in there, like you're saying, Ben. Like, just like that's what the audience wants these days. I don't know. That's where I take a little bit of issue with that, or I question that, I should say.
Yeah, like I really appreciate being told techniques. I never really get on board with the idea of like advice, if you get what I mean. Like when someone tells you what works in a book, I think it's the same as like reviewing books. It's like it has to be on a subjective level that you say this, because otherwise you're you're acting like an omnipotent, like I'm all knowing and everyone has to listen to me. So then I think it's
Yes.
the same with writing, where like there has to be a sense of like I think if you learn how different forms of metaphors work, all different types of language, like different types of dialogue, etc., you can implement those yourself based on what you enjoy. But and like videos that explain those things, I think it's just that they wouldn't perform well, if you get what I mean. Like when someone is telling you advice and they're like, this is what you should do, rather than here's a technique. It's like the difference between watching a YouTube video and going to a lecture. Everyone's going to watch a YouTube video. Like no one wants to sit through, like most people don't want to sit through a lecture. And so I think that's the difference. It's like a guide rather than like well, actually, that's not the right word. I'm using
I
like
love what you're saying though. No, I love what you're saying. I think it can be useful if it's like you're saying, like as a technique, if it's more descriptive of like these are options and these are trending right now, rather than prescriptive,
yeah.
whereas like you have to do this in order to have a successful book kind of thing. That's where I think I would maybe have like some area of nuance there, or some area of like,
It's funny you say that, Ben, because during COVID, I watched like the entire semester of Brandon Sanderson's like writing lectures. Because they're all on YouTube.
Didn't we all?
that's what I
I
would get
definitely
nervous
watched.
about that. Ugh, how does he approach that kind of thing?
Well, I don't remember necessarily all of the content about it now, but I thought they were really good lectures because he talks about like it's not like one of those writing tips videos necessarily where he's like, you have to do this, but he talks about like the promises that you make to the reader at the start of a book and like the fact that you have to have a sense of progress throughout a book, like no matter how you choose to do that or how it fits into your story, and then you have to have like payoff. So it's sort of stuff like that where they're like, if you've promised something to the reader, then obviously there's something to be said for subverting tropes. But for somebody to be satisfied after reading your book, you kind of have to like pay off what you've promised. And then like it's sort of that, in my mind, it's subjective advice because he's saying like whatever you're choosing to write, these are some important things that you should consider, not like you have to put this in your book and you have to put this in your book. I don't know. I thought his lectures were really good and I watched them before. Well, actually, I'm trying to remember at exactly what point I watched them. I don't think I had actually read a lot of his books at that time. I think that I was like partway through Stormlight when I watched those. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have any experience in this like avenue. I know that Ben really doesn't, but one thing that I find that falls into the trope thing so bad is romance books, and like I don't fault them as much because a lot of the times they're like lighter and fun reads anyway, but I feel like whenever people talk about them and recommend them, it's literally just a collection of tropes. Like you don't even know what the book's about. And I don't like even mind because I'll pick them up anyway because I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I like that trope." But it'll be like, "Oh yeah, this is an enemies to lovers like rivals romance." And that's like obviously you can read the synopsis and go deeper into it, but when they're being pitched, it's sort of like this is all you need to know about it and you don't even know what the book's about.
That's so true about romance, by the way. And I do I thought this was an interesting comment too about magical realism using lit fiction, because there are tropes that transcend fantasy too, that are not just fantasy tropes. I think we have ones in fantasy that we identify as fantasy tropes, but there are tropes that are in all types of literature, and especially in especially in romance, like you said. It's like love triangle, hate to love, friends to lovers. I don't
Forced
know.
proximity,
First
like
proximity,
stuff like
fake
that.
dating trope, or getting back
I'm a
together.
sucker for fake dating.
Yeah.
It's like the romance version of when people say like Name of the Wind meets the Long Price Quartet. Like that is
Yeah.
it's
Meets
for
The
those things.
Hunger Games, meets Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like I like both of those things. These are things I like, and it's like for romance, it's the same thing. It's like enemies to lovers. That is me, so I'm taking it, and like I think
Yeah.
it works well on that. Like I don't read romance particularly. I think I read particularly more romance that's involved in a different genre, but
Yeah, well, it's
like
actually
even
funny because I feel like the love for me of the romance tropes that I like, it doesn't even come from romance books. It actually comes from fan fiction, and the distinction is that like when you read a lot of that type of thing, you already know and love the characters, and then you're seeing them being put into like a certain situation. So while I will still pick up romance books, um, based on the tropes, it's sort of like the author has to be skilled at least at giving a groundwork for their characters because you don't know them at the beginning. They could be anyone. I'm sorry, I'm getting us totally off topic right
No, it's okay. I'm enjoying it.
now. But
this is the romance episode.
yeah, and I'm
I'm
not
actually
even a romance reader, so
That's
who
funny because
knew?
I've actually been having some conversations lately with people about romance in books. I actually find it an interesting topic, just because I feel like even if it's not the focus of the book, if it's just like a sub part of a subplot, or if there's like a spicy, sexy time scene or whatever in a book, it's interesting to me like whether the author chooses to romanticize that or whether they choose to make that, it's kind of a separate topic, or whether they choose to make it disturbing or realistic, or whatever their choices are and why they're doing it. I find it really interesting, and then I was thinking about how that translates to a lot of aspects of fantasy, because a lot of people take issue with romance, and especially it seems like in fantasy circles a lot of readers take issue with romantic scenes and how they're depicted in
Mhm.
fantasy. I just feel like I hear a lot of criticism about it, and it makes me wonder though about the way battle is portrayed and how realistic
Yeah.
that is, and how sensationalized or romanticized battle is compared to how it is realistically. And so I guess I've just been drawing that comparison in my mind lately.
Yeah, I don't know if this
Kind of
is
off topic.
exactly the comparison you're drawing, like, it's definitely part of what you said, but it's interesting to think about those 2 things, battle and, like, sex, I guess, and how different people, like, view them and what their preferences are, because obviously a lot of people, don't want an author to, like, shy away from either one of them, but then there's also a lot of people that, prefer like a fade to black or like a behind closed doors scene for like sex in particular. And then in battle, some authors do seem to do that where like they'll still depict some of it, but rather than going into detail and like choreographing a battle, they'll kind of like maybe give you snapshots of the beginning of it. And then they're kind of like, and this is how it turned out.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know, like, I never really thought about the comparison between those 2 things before, but the way they're handled could be, you know, analogous or whatever.
Yeah, that is very
Yeah.
interesting. I think for fantasy, there's a lot of people like me as a teenager where I was like, this person's talking to a woman that is highly inaccurate. That does not happen. That I've never seen it. I've never experienced it. I don't believe that this person's just able to talk to someone they're interested in.
I've never
So
met a woman.
yeah, it's the Robert Jordan school of of writing. Yeah, I think I think yeah, it is weird how I genuinely think I think it's changing now, but when you look at the 90s backwards, like it's a what would be considered like male orientated in some ways for like popular fantasy that typically a bit I don't know. it tends to lead towards either it's like an 80s B movie a lot of the times for fantasy novels, where they were like, well, we need to fit it in here. How do we fit it in? Oh, it's a brutal world, so SA, and they're like, that's how it gets in there. And you read it and you're like, what choice have you made? And like that happens a lot. So I think we're moving, luckily enough, we're moving away from that. But sometimes you read it, like, I know with A Song of Ice and Fire, when I started that, I was like, some of this is going too far for me. And like there are other authors, I think, like Robert Jordan has a relationship that is, because he's very fade to black, very off in terms of that, but he has a relationship which has like domestic abuse and that type of thing. And there's all of them seem to have even down to like Hob has some horrible relationships. And I think all of them, I don't know, it's just a trend that happens.
You know what's interesting though? I just recently finished a book by, have you all heard of the author Mercedes Lackey?
Yeah, never read anything from her, but I've heard of her.
Yeah, so I just finished an audiobook, Arrows of the Queen. I picked that up. Actually, Elliot Brooks has been covering this book a lot on her channel, and I got really curious because Mercedes Lackey she wrote that in the 80s, and she's one of those authors that I saw a lot decades ago, and I always regretted not picking up her books because she was a female adult fantasy author, and I knew she had, I mean, she was well known for a long time, but I never hear about her. And I just regretted never giving her attention. So when I heard about her book and was hearing such positive reviews, I got curious and I picked up the audiobook because I saw it on Scribd. And I usually am not very comfortable with audiobooks, fantasy audiobooks. So I took this one very slowly and I re-listened to passages several times to make sure I understood what was going on. And I was so impressed. There were things in the story that definitely show its age. It was, like I said, written in the 80s, and I could see it not appealing to a lot of modern audiences for various reasons, but there were things she did that were like so impressive to me, including the way she represented LGBTQ at the time, like same-sex relationships between women and just relationships in general, and even just the way she handled like emotions and the way she handled like she had emotionally intelligent dialogue between characters. Like, I don't want to give away too much, but there's a scene where this character has to kind of like reparent a younger character, and the way she goes about it was so intelligent and empathetic and sensitive. And I could not believe that this was written in the 80s, like with the way that she was thinking about those things, like the sensitive way she was thinking about those things. And it wasn't like she was pointing it out in the story. It's like I was able to identify it because I have a husband who's a counselor, and he's like, we've had a lot of conversations and I've read books on like emotional intelligence and things like that. But just to notice those things in the dialogue and in the representation in the story, the way it was just seamlessly and very effortlessly woven into the story. I'm still thinking about it like a couple of days later. I'm like, dang, that was really impressive. Like really impressive. And this was a female fantasy author.
Bookstores. That makes me kind of want to like actually buy one of her books.
Yeah. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I actually I have one of her books, but it's actually my housemate. I was ordering some books online, and it was like get one free, and my housemate was like, pick up a Mercedes Lackey book for me, and so I did, because he'd heard of her because he listens to a lot of like music on YouTube, and it came up that I think she releases concept albums for each of her books or something, or each of her series. And he'd had one of those and was like, I kind of want to read the book that matches that series now. So I do actually have one of her books. So I should read that at some point. And I was going to say that it reminds me of what we were talking about when I was talking about what the kind of what the general thought of 80s fantasy is in terms of but then at the same time you've always got that person. It's the same as science fiction.
Yeah.
When you think about science fiction back in the 80s, you think of like quite dry and plot focused and science focused, but then you've got Octavia Butler doing everything she did, and it's
That's
like
what came to my mind too.
yeah, there's always that person that if you know them, then you're in the know. But otherwise, it's just they fall under the radar. And I think that's why it's good, like you bringing up Mercedes Lackey and everything. It's like it's bring those people to the forefront and give them a bit more of a voice, because otherwise they're gonna slip away, type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
what you guys are like, just this whole section of the conversation has been about, I think, is like just emphasizing how, like, no matter what you want to put in your book in terms of like character relationships and stuff, for me, like as a character driven reader, whether I like it or not definitely just depends on how you handle it, like in terms of sensitivity. And I know that Hob is depressing at times, but I've always personally found that she's like very skilled at writing the emotions, and that's probably why she gets the emotional response from me that she does. And so like there's a distinction there where if you're really good at like handling and evoking those emotions and the character relationships, then it doesn't generally feel as though you're putting it in there just for the sake of it, or like not handling it well, as long as that, I guess, like care and effort is taken. And it sounds like Mercedes Lackey does that as well. And so that's something that appeals to me without a doubt.
Yeah, I was just so impressed because like a lot of the things she was doing, I'm like, those are things that we consider modern conventions in our day and age. But she was doing that back in the 80s. And I know a lot of people are saying this here. A lot of people, because I did mention it in my last video, and I did have a few comments of people saying, I love Mercedes Lackey. Yes, she was very well known for this, for her representation, for having a gay protagonist in another book. And I mean, but like you said, Ben, I don't, at the same time, I'm always somebody who tries, when I read a book from the 80s or 90s or earlier, I always try to like put on the lens of that time era and understand what was normalized and what was more, even if there were people who were doing things like this, like I do try to take into account, okay, that wasn't the majority of people. And like, I always try to be a little bit soft in my assessment because of that. But yeah, it's always nice to know about these kind of authors who were doing it back then, especially for female adult fantasy authors, because I don't feel like we hear a lot about them. Like the only one I hear about from that time really is Robin Hobb. And I'm getting to know Jenny Wirtz now, but that's it. Oh, and she is still publishing, by the way. She is still publishing. Somebody mentioned that. She is, I think that so the book I read, I think it's book 1, if I'm not mistaken, in the Valdemir world. And she has a ton of books in that same world. And I think that one book, she's going to be publishing a book this summer too. So that's part in that world too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you can't be adding more people for me to read.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm hesitant because, like I said, I mean, there are certain things she does. Like, for example, she does a lot of the world building through the narrator telling you things instead of like immersing you in the setting as much, and like the character asking questions and another character explaining things. I could see how some people like nowadays that might not go over as well for some modern readers, like things like that. So I would say have a soft assessment again, even just for that time era, but I think it's pretty cool. Still, I enjoyed it.
Arrows of the Queen has been added to my Goodreads.
Yay! I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
I will get to it in 2 to 3 business years.
Yeah, I'm just so I was just so impressed. It was such a whim for me, and I've already picked up the second audiobook, so I've already started that. But
actually, I should
probably
just
take
look
a
and
while.
see if my library has it, because that changes things as well.
Yeah.
Or just the like secondhand bookstores.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, she was all over the shelves back in the 80s and 90s, but I just regret that I didn't get to her sooner. A lot of people though have been telling me they're like that they've enjoyed her books. Like I've heard a lot of people since I mentioned her, so I'm really glad to see that. But I want to ask you too about reading taste in general, because Ben, you have a wonderful series on your channel about reading from various booktubers, and I just would love to hear what you've learned about your reading taste from doing those experiments. If you want to talk about more than that too, please feel free.
Yeah, I started doing that because I was aware that I had started pretty much all of the popular series that I wanted to get to. Like I'd at least tried, like even if I didn't get along with them, I tried The Witcher, Wheel of Time. I'd read Brandon Sanderson, Hob, like Malazan, all of the big ones I'd started, and so I started it from the sense of wanting to see what was like other content creators' favorites, rather than, I don't know, because sometimes a lot of people's favorites aren't ones they actively even talk about a lot on their channel because they've either talked about them to exhaustion, like years ago when they started their channel, or uh, it doesn't quite pop off the way it does in the algorithm. Like it's rare to see. I don't think anyone's chosen Brandon Sanderson as the yeah. There you go. Yeah, Beowulf. I luckily I'm of an age that I was born back in like the 700s, so I already knew old Indian English. I just I hide my own. But
I'm
yeah, like
suddenly feeling
think,
young.
I don't think Brandon Sanderson's ever come up on one of the, like, even though he's the most popular author, I don't think anyone's chosen one of his books as like their favorites at the moment. And a lot of the most popular series don't get picked, whereas the lesser known series sometimes get picked up a bit more. That I find that I enjoy looking at that, and then it's why I always ask a book that they don't think people know they love, or one they think deserves more attention, because it's kind of what I want from the series is to find series or books that I never would have thought about picking up, or to just give me incentive to keep going with stuff that I've already read. But yeah, like it's funny. For instance, Philip chose Mrs. Dalloway. Like Mrs. Dalloway is a book that I love. Virginia Woolf. I think I've read 3 Virginia Woolf books, and absolutely adore it. Then you've got Jake from Man Carrying Thing choosing the wildest like crime books, like translated from French and everything. That got me into reading more translated fictions. Yeah, I'm unfortunately, whilst being very old, I'm also very stupid. So it's taken me a while to but maybe this time we'll get through the course.
One, I guess, kind of phenomenon that I feel like you experience with that series as well, though, Ben, is that when you ask someone for their favorites, I feel like a lot of people are gonna think about it and say, well, even if Brandon Sanderson's series are a favorite for me, let me go with something that I personally feel deserves more attention. Like, I could choose that, but I could also choose this, like, lesser known favorite and then hear someone talk about it because, like, they probably have no shortage of, like, people talking about Sanderson, if that makes sense. Like, not that that's not also their favorite and they could have picked it, but, like, I don't know, I've done that, like, when we've been invited to be in videos to talk about, like, favorite books, I'm like, well, I don't wanna choose the same thing every time necessarily, so let me choose something that I feel like I wanna mention this time and wanna have talked about.
Yeah, it's like because it's such a pressure question. It's like it's the absolute pressure cooker style. You've asked the question, you've boxed them in, and they are just you're left to cook in there because it's such a difficult question. So I think it sets off a little anxious part of your brain that you overthink the decision so much that you give creative answers regardless. Like even if you were like, I'm just going to give them a straightforward answers. Your brain in the background is like, oh my God, what am I going to choose? I've got so many, and you go off the wall.
Yeah.
And like I've seen people, because I've done it to other people as well, where someone asks me to do something, and I answer a question, and then it'll be like my favorite series, and then when I actually make a favorite series list, it's like 7th. And I'm like, why did that wasn't my answer. It's never been my answer. But for some reason, I was like, that's the one today. My mind has made up.
Well, I don't rank my favorites, so I could be like, "This is my favorite that I'm gonna talk about today."
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I mean, I have such a hard time with ranking. I still haven't done I know it's like the typical BookTube protocol to have a top 10 fantasy series video. And I want to do one someday, and I do enjoy watching them. But man, that's like the hardest. I just feel
See,
like that's such a hard concept.
I did mine based on when I read them. Least
Oh,
recent
that's
to most
smart.
recent. So I was like, there's no subjectivity in this. It's like they're ranked the way they're ranked, and I can just talk about them. So like nobody's gonna be like, why'd you put this one above this one? Because it's like an objective way of ordering them.
That's really smart because because recency bias is a thing anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, like
I
I
want to
think
say it is, but go ahead. Sorry.
well, I made my list and I put what's the word? I put Greenbone above Long Price Quartet, which I now don't think I would do. But when I put it up, Alan just appeared like a behemoth behind me. I turned around and he was there, like, "What are you doing, putting like Greenbone above Long Price?" And at the time, I was like, it put me in the defensive bit. I was like, "It's good, I swear." But now
As
when
soon
I'm
as
back,
you
I'm like,
clicked publish on the video, Alan was in your room.
yeah.
That is so funny. Yay. And then you redeemed Ben, Grace, because you listed Long Price Quartet in one of those videos, right? Where you were asked for a
Oh
favorite.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so funny.
Recency
I
bias
still
totally is a thing though.
It
Oh,
is, and I am having a book hangover today, you all, because I just finished A Storm of Swords last night. And part of me kept thinking with A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm like, man, like I had the opposite question in mind. I'm like, was it because at the time I just hadn't read much fantasy? Is it gonna hold up for me nowadays?
Yeah.
Man, I feel destroyed after that reread. My goodness.
Oh, I
It's so
felt
good.
totally the same way because it was the first adult fantasy series that I read. So, like, I hadn't read anything pretty much in
Yeah.
fantasy except for Harry Potter. So it's like this was a big girl pants time for A Song of Ice and Fire, and it
Same
works.
here. Same here. Yeah. I think largely the same for me. I had read some adult fantasy, but not very much. Not very much.
I had
Yeah.
read Mistborn. That's it. I'd read Mistborn and then A Song of Ice and Fire. And to be fair, I think I mean like A Storm of Swords is one of the best fantasy books ever, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
and I realized that like the first two, when I made reviews, I made like they were like 10 minutes. I was trying to be really good, and then I sat down and I realized that I could not talk about Storm of Swords without first it being complete spoilers, and then I spoke for about 45 minutes just to the camera, and then at the end of it, I was like, I'm gonna really have to cut that down because I was just talking about how much I loved every aspect.
I'm
Um,
gonna go and watch your video. I haven't yet because I just wanted
oh,
to
it's
finish
not
it
up
just to.
yet.
Oh, it's
It
not? Oh,
no,
okay.
no,
I
no.
thought
I need to edit it.
okay. Because your last video, I did watch your other video, your March wrap up, and I think you said it was up. So maybe I was like, oh no, I think I missed that.
Maybe
Yeah,
you
it
didn't
Okay,
want
might.
it
to
got
go
out
on
of
it
order.
like a madman.
Yeah. The problem is I edited it and it was gonna be up, but then the file got corrupted, so I need to re-edit the video.
Oh
So
no.
it should
Oh,
have
I'm
been up by
sorry.
now, but then I opened the file and it was like, nah, that's gone, buddy. Sorry, you'll have to do that
Yeah.
again. So
Yeah. So it seems like Jimmy here from the Fantasy Network really likes your approach, Grace. He said that it's actually way better because it shows your own personal lineage through the genre and how you got there, which is
That's so
so
good.
true, because like I
Yeah.
think the order that you read a certain fantasy series is probably going to shape the way that you build your expectations of fantasy, your approach to reading fantasy. It's going to affect that, I would think.
I think it
So,
totally does because if you come
yeah.
across a series that people think like they don't, well, maybe they don't like it as much because they've seen that type of thing before, but it's one of the first things you read, you're obviously not going to think that. Like it's the first time you've seen it. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think that like we're lucky because now there's so much more diverse stories being told. So you kind of have more opportunity to like I don't know, read something that's really unique and is kind of just being broken into now, but yeah, I should get into some older fantasy because I'm doing it backwards for sure.
Yeah, maybe because I am a little older, I am always nostalgic for the classic fantasy stuff. I'm always nostalgic for it. Whereas I feel like everybody nowadays wants the fond du lis. They want the more modern type of approach. and I'm up for that too. I mean, I didn't really resonate with Jade City. I'm gonna try rereading it at some point this year, I think, via audio and just see how it goes. But yeah, I don't know. I never get tired of like the older stuff or the older historic feeling. And I feel like there's a ton of fantasy written in the 80s and 90s. I just still haven't, I don't know. I feel like I need to go back and read it. Like Tad
Yeah.
Williams, author, I really need to get to.
Yeah, I really want to. Well, I've heard Ted Williams compared to Hobb in writing a couple times now, and that makes me really want to get to him. I do have the Dragonbone chair and the Stone of Farewell on my shelf. So
Mhm.
we found those both on the same day, I think, actually, at like secondhand stores or whatever. So yeah.
Cool.
It's
Yeah, this is interesting, by the way, Liam, because I've said this in a couple of videos, but when I read the 5 books about 11 years ago, I just never in my mind, I know people even did it back then, but even in my mind, I never ranked books. Like that just never, that's just not how my brain worked. Maybe it still doesn't work very well that way, but I just never ranked them. I just loved every single book. Like I loved every single one. So I don't know. I just find that interesting. Sorry, just wanted to mention that. Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
I don't think I don't rank, like, do you know when like people do tier rankings of books within series? I always struggle with that typically. But I usually have like I know my favorite and my least favorite typically. But everything in the between is just
Hmm.
it's very fluid.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that with like when the idea of like saying this is an A tier and this one's a B tier. I'm like, I don't know what that difference is. Like,
No, I don't
what
either.
is the difference between that? I don't know. So I struggle with that. But I
Yeah,
think
my brain doesn't really work that way. Yeah.
yeah. I was going to say that I think what I'm realizing, like with the idea of needing to read Tad Williams, Mercedes Lackey, like all these people, it is what we were talking about earlier when, well, actually before the stream, where you were saying that undergraduate is where you're like, oh, I understand now, and then masters is like, oh god, and then your PhD is like, I don't know anything. I feel like where I've reached now in reading fantasy, because I read like I don't read all fantasy, so I feel like I'm compared to a lot of people who started at the same time with me, my progression is very far behind. Um, because I've read a lot, I've started a lot of series, I haven't finished a lot of series. So I find myself thinking like, I'm at that point where I feel like I'm at the end of an undergraduate where I'm like, I've got a really good basic understanding of a lot of different types of fantasy, but I have no more than that. And now I'm aware of all these different authors that I need to get to, and that fills me with nothing but fear. And I feel like I have less authority in, like, I feel less authority in what I'm saying now that I've read more than I did when I started. And I was just like gung ho, being like, Warbreaker sucks, and like, like just saying anything. Whereas now I come to it and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh god, I have no authority in the slightest on my opinion.
It's
There's
funny,
so much.
like, 2 things that you said, Ben. Like, first thing is that the only series I've ever felt like I could do the tier ranking style with was Wheel of Time, and I did do it. And it's funny because, like, that's one series where I feel like more than other series has so much inconsistency in quality. Like, there's so much, like, I don't know, Crossroads of Twilight, like, hurts me personally that it exists, but then the highs of that series are, like, really high for me, and so most
Mm.
books, like, if I'm loving a series, most of the time, I will love them on relatively equal levels as long as things are going well, and I don't feel like I can separate those definitively, but with Wheel of Time, I was like, first of all, there's 15 books here. I think we can definitely make it work. Second of all, there is some separation. And then the second thing is that I think it's funny the way that you like compared your reading experience to like feeling more confident in yourself before or your like opinions about fantasy than you do now because um I'm definitely the opposite. Like when I discovered booktube, like you had obviously read Mistborn, you were more I think like aware of the general fantasy community as a whole. Whereas obviously I had read A Song of Ice and Fire, which somebody commented earlier that we're so young. So when I read that back in like 2012 or 2013, I was like 15, 16.
Yeah.
And then I had and when I discovered BookTube at the start of COVID, I had never heard of Sanderson, never heard of Joe Abercrombie, never heard of Malazan, never heard of anyone, literally. Like, it's not an exaggeration to say that I did not know. Like, I knew I liked fantasy just because of like my like childhood and teenage experiences with the types of media that I like to consume, even through like TV shows and stuff. But when I started my channel, I was like, I have read kind of like two fantasy books or two fantasy series, like Stormlight and Mistborn, and now I'm like, okay, I feel a lot more widely and deeply read in fantasy, even though there are still so many like series that I want to get to. So I assume Philip is referring to me saying that I was 15 in 2012.
Probably. Yeah, it's crazy the way that BookTube has changed all that, right? The awareness factor of everything. And I feel like it's both. I know everybody was doing videos about this like a couple months ago because of that article, but I feel like it's sort of a good thing. And then it's something that there's something part of me that feels a little bit of grief about it. Because, like, for example, with The Song of Ice and Fire, if you didn't read that before the show, chances are it's not going to have quite the same impact. I mean, even if you didn't watch the show, it's so much in our culture now that I don't feel like I mean, I saw somebody post a Game of Thrones discussion, and with the thumbnail art was the scene, a very specific scene at the end of a Game of Thrones. That I'm like, that is like a very spoilery scene, you know?
Oh,
and I'm
God.
like, it's an awesome thumbnail. And I was like, I love that art piece. But you know, we're past a point where anything where you can really go into that experience the same. You know, I feel that way anyway.
No, I
So I get
completely
kind of
agree
sad.
with you. It's something that is just so like, even if you haven't sought it out, you've probably just heard like people talk about it, and even if they didn't mean to, like an offhand comment where it means that you know something that happens later in the show, or like certain events that have like certain names where you're probably like, I can kind of guess what that is based on the fact that it has a name. Something that happens in the third book.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yep. And I
Well, I
imagine
think
the same thing would happen if we ever get a Mistborn adaptation. I'm sure the same thing will happen someday about things happening in that first book.
absolutely. I was the first thing that came into my head, I thought of a name that you could call one thing, and I was like, let's not get into that. But I think it's like Game of Thrones has hit a Star Wars level of or like there are certain
That's a good
things
one.
like when you say spoilers for Star Wars, but like an I Am Your Father type thing where it's like it's
Yeah.
such a pop culture thing that kids now watching it. Like I remember watching it as a kid and not realizing that was meant to be a twist because every single person in the entire world, when you say I'm watching Star Wars, it's like I Am Your Father type thing. Like that is just it's just something that everyone says, and I think
You missed the boat. You were born 20 years too late. Actually, no, more like 35 years too late because you wouldn't have been at the theater as an infant.
well, as we know, I was alive in 700.
Oh, that's true. That's
so
true.
I was actually around for. I don't know what I was doing during that time period. 1977, I just didn't go to the cinema. I didn't see it, but yeah, it's one of those. And then I was trying to think of what else has it. But yeah, it's where it becomes such a like pop culture thing that there's no getting away from it.
Well, Lord of the Rings has it, right?
Lord of the Rings, definitely. To be fair, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was putting spoilers in his own chapter names. Like my man was crazy. Like
that's true.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's true. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, like end of the first book. I remember looking at it. Of course, I've seen the films countless times before reading it. But I remember opening it and being like, well, who thought to name it that?
Yeah. Yeah. It looks like Philip was living in the golden age because I actually kind of was too. I mean, Star Wars was a big thing already before I was born, but at the same time, I feel like when I watched it, we didn't have like pop culture the way it is now. I still feel like I got away with like it being a surprise for me.
Well, when you don't have social media, it doesn't get that quite that like dissemination to every corner of the world quite as quickly, right? Like you
Right.
might have like the person at school or whatever that wanted to spoil it for you, but that's sort of like an in-person thing where like if you managed to avoid if you managed to not go looking for it and like avoid it, I feel like you could.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think we've probably all experienced that as well. Like the internet spoiling something. Like I know you definitely have with Wheel of Time, Grace. I think
Oh,
you've said that you had something come up, and like Twitter's the worst place for it. When the show came out and everyone's like, "Oh, I'm just gonna post spoilers, bro. That's fine." If you haven't read this series, all 15 by the time the show comes out, that's on you. And I'm like, what are you doing? And the
Yeah.
problem is because that's algorithm based. If you like one tweet to do with Wheel of Time, they're all getting inundated on you. So then all of a sudden, all the spoilers are there. That was a bad time. I had to hide from Twitter.
have I
Yeah, spoilers are the
shared
worst. I
have
got
I
spoiled for the end of Red Rising, the end of the Red Rising trilogy based on things in the next book for the second trilogy. And it wasn't,
Mm,
yeah, it was a spoiler. And it was just from watching a video and the person was so innocent about it. They didn't realize what they were saying would spoil me for that book. It was like they forgot and I'm like, "Oh no, I didn't know that this was going to happen." And yeah, I was really sad about it. But I also wonder, do you think that having a channel too, do you feel like there's an extra sort of like scrutiny on you as a booktuber when you're reading certain series, like especially like big series? Because I think about that for Malaz and Book of the Fallen. So I started that series before I started a channel and before there was like hardly any content on Malazan on BookTube. So I read Gardens of the Moon even before I knew about Philip's channel. I think before Philip even had a channel or anything. And then it wasn't until like book 3 when there was starting to emerge a lot more content on Malazan. But now that I've finished the series, I feel like so many people are getting into it. And I almost feel for them because now there's such a huge fandom on BookTube. And everybody's like, oh, what are you going to think about the end of book 2 or this? And da, da, da. You know, there's like so much I don't know. I just feel like there's so much energy on you as a booktuber of like how you're going to react to certain things. Whereas like I felt like the nice thing for me, at least starting the series prior to having a channel, is I could just have my experience with it without having everybody like watching my experience, if that makes sense.
No, I definitely agree with that. Like the thing I think that you said is that I agree with the most is like kind of people wondering what you're going to think about it because I'm obviously going to be honest. Like I think that I'm less harsh than some people when it comes to ratings and thoughts and everything. But even still, like if I have high hopes for something and then I don't like it, part of my brain is basically like, well, people know I'm reading this, so I can't just put it aside. I kind of have to like talk about it now and say that I didn't like it. And it's not a great feeling, but I'm also like not gonna not be honest about it because I wouldn't want to like do that to people also, like pretend that I felt something that I didn't. Um, but then another thing, like, and this is sort of the same topic, but when I was doing my Wheel of Time spoiler chats, I would sometimes get like comments that were the most I wanna say mansplainy things that I've ever read.
Oh no. I'm
And
so
I'm kind of
sorry.
like, "Okay, I'm sharing my experience with you, but at the end of the day, it still is, like, my thoughts and feelings." So I don't really, like, need anybody to tell me, like, why I'm wrong about my feelings. Um, so yeah, like I don't know. On the whole, I obviously enjoy having a channel. Like sometimes I
Mhm.
think about the fact that the experience of reading would be different if I didn't talk about it on the platform. Like you'd just be kind of like free to like, I don't know, do whatever. But then when I weigh that against like still wanting to make videos. Obviously, having a channel wins out, and still wanting to do that.
Yeah. And I don't even necessarily mean like not liking something. It's more just like there's a difference, I think, between experience, even something you like, the experience of just reading something and having your own experience with it, just your own natural experience with it, versus feeling everybody's eyes on you. Because I don't want to put him on the spot. I won't put him on the spot, but I know somebody who was talking about this actually now that I'm thinking about it. But it's like everybody's like, what are you going to think when you read, this or that? Or what are you going to think when you read Miss Ward? What are you going to think when you read Joy Abercrombie? Or when you read this? Like just feeling like there's almost, even if you like something, it's like there's just so much with having so many eyes on you, so to speak. What about
Yeah.
you?
It's genuinely the reason I don't make TBRs. And I almost, apart from putting it on Goodreads what I'm reading, I only put after I finished a book. I don't put before what I'm reading typically, because I tend to that avoids that situation for me. That like the most I'll do is say put in Discord that I'm reading this book, but I really try to avoid having someone be aware of what I'm reading at the time, unless I trust them not to like either. Like sometimes it's almost like flirtatious, some people get, in the sense of like, are you reading this thing? I know everything that happens. And they're like, oh, wait for, and it's like it's almost like it's evidently like a serotonin boost when you, because there's that sense of power, that sense of like knowledge that you have if you've read something that someone else hasn't, and you're like, whoa. But and I always
I feel like
like,
I do that to you. Do you hate it?
no, I don't hate it. I hate it when people that I don't know do it to me. It's the thing. When you do it, I'm like, it's like a playful thing. But when it's just a random person, they're like, oh, and I'm just like, maybe let's just let me. I don't know.
Just let me read it.
It's I don't know, but I typically avoid people knowing what I'm reading until I finished it. I also take such massive gaps. Like I just read Fires of Heaven, and I read Shadow Rising like 10 months beforehand. So there's no way anyone can predict that Fires of Heaven was coming up unless they were randomly on my Discord and heard about it, because no one's predicting like, oh, it's been 10 months, it's on the clock, he's going to read it now. So I feel like I'm so spontaneous that there's no way for people to have an idea.
You're such a free spirit.
That's a pretty smart way of going about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love making TBRs, so I guess I'm creating that problem for myself in a way.
No, I think, but I mean, there could be a fun side to it too, that
I just love
everybody's getting to watch.
Like, even with like the fantasy bingo, as soon as it like drops, I look at it and I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to read all these books, but I have so much fun like picking them and planning them out. And then after that, I kind of like forget about it. But the process.
Do you follow your TBRs pretty well, or?
I do follow. I would say it's not a matter of not following them. It's just a matter of not always finishing them. And then like if I like in March, for example, I had like a TBR of a bunch of long books. And then kind of in the middle of the month, I was like, okay, I need to do something about this because I'm feeling very tired. Even though I'm liking the books, it's like being in the middle of a couple of really long books and not feeling like I'm making that much progress or feeling close to finishing anything. I'm like, I kind of have to do something about this and like read something else. So that I like, it's not about the number of books that I'm finishing in a month, but it's more about the sense of like motivation for me, where I'm like, okay, if I actually feel like I can finish a book in good time, I'll feel better about myself.
Yeah. No, I'm always curious about that. I kind of like having a loose TBR. I think for some reason there's something about it that I've grown to like, which is interesting because prior to having a channel, I never had a TBR. I just winged it totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I also have like choice paralysis. I feel like if I do finish my
Mm.
TBR and I have the pressure of like choosing what I'm going to read at the end of the month, I will look at my
Mhm.
shelves and be like, there are so many options. I have no idea what to do. So I think that's part of it for me as well. The structure helps.
Yeah, I've heard
I
that before. Mhm.
I am the absolute worst at choice, like choosing a book to read, and Grace definitely knows this because like the last time I chose a book, I took about 20 books off the shelf, and we
Yes.
went through 4 rounds of like wiggling it
Selection, like
down until there were
narrowing
some
it
books
down.
left. Yeah, because
Wow.
I want to read everything all at once. Like if I could read everything, I would.
What did we
Um,
do? We did first impression of the cover. Like he held up the book and I either said yes or no within like a second. I couldn't think about it. And then second one was the first sentence of the book. And I didn't know what book it was, but I just said yes or no based on the first sentence. And then what did we do? You eliminated the bottom half based on Goodreads ratings,
yeah.
and then you put them on an Instagram poll.
Yeah. So like it was like a round robin to get rid of it. It was like an
Yeah.
elimination round thing. However, I do think as much as that when I think about that, I'm like, that's a video. Like
Yeah.
doing that with you, like showing it and stuff, I'm like, that is a video, and I don't know why we didn't record it.
You all
Nevertheless,
should have done that. Yeah, we should do
yeah,
it in the
exactly.
That's
But
future.
fine if you want to, we can.
we could do another one, yeah. But my problem is like I typically am like, oh, I want to read fantasy, and then when I finish that, I'm like, oh, but the Booker International Prize came out. Like, I want to read one of the long list. The Women's Prize came out. I want to read one of that long list. Then I need to continue the series, and like, I just, I
Meanwhile, you already had a long list of books that you needed to read.
yeah, exactly. And then all of these just supplant it. So then all of the books I already wanted to read just get moved down. So then I just,
Yeah.
You do a
it's
good job of balancing genres, by the way, Ben.
We
Do you have a strategy for that? I mean, or do you find you're naturally inclined that, like, once you read a literary fiction book, for example, that you gravitate towards fantasy or speculative fiction, or how do you
uh
go about that?
usually buddy reads do a great job for me. So like the A
Mhm.
Song of Ice and Fire, me and Grace read Realm of the Elderlings together. That really helps. That if I typically have one buddy read series going on at a time, and then that fills the kind of quota for fantasy in my brain. So then and like at the moment we're doing the me Philip Johan we're doing the read along of the Books of Babel, and then Grace and Alan are also part of that. And so like I have those going on. So then alongside it, I'm like I can then weave in alongside. I typically read 2 books at the same time. So then I'm like, okay, now a literary can come in. It's only 150 pages long. I can rifle through it. They're what I take to uni typically as well. So if I've got a spare 30 minutes or something, I'll read through that, and it's just I don't know. It works well. I think it has worked well for me at the very least. I don't think I could read just one or the other. I think I'd burn out. So like having the back and forth nature helps me a lot.
Yeah. I've just like kind of, it was weird because before having a channel, I read a lot of, I think I was pretty balanced in the genres I was reading. And then once I started a channel, I don't know, it wasn't intentional at all. It just happened that, I mean, fantasy is my favorite genre. It just is. And so I mostly just read fantasy like the whole first year of my channel. And now I haven't intentionally even done this at all, but somehow I just keep on reading more literary fiction. Like it just keeps on coming up in my TBR, and part of it's buddy reads. So that's interesting. Buddy reads have definitely shaped my reading plans like 100, probably 100% these days, but not in a bad way at all.
I think buddy reads for me shape, well, this is obvious because it's like the feature of a buddy read, but it shapes like when I read something more than like what I want to read, right? Like, and I'm sure
Yeah.
that applies to a lot of people. Like, when I look back at the last few years of reading, I think like I may not have read that series when I did. Like, it might have, I don't know, like languished on my TBR a little longer if I didn't have the push to read it then. But
Mhm.
then of course, like it's the whole point of a buddy read, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
So I
when
would, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
oh no, so go ahead.
No, I want to hear what you're going to say.
Oh, I was gonna be like the problem is when is when you start a buddy read and suddenly you're like, oh, that's like Hob. Hob was started as like it was just a random one-off for me. It was like, I'm going to try this, and then suddenly you read it, and not even the first book, it's the second book. And when we read it, like me and Grace read it together, it was like, Hob is now somehow going to be the first big series I finish. Like that is because I'm not going to finish the Wheel of Time or Malazan. I think Hob, the Realm of the Eldlings, will be the first like 10+ book series that I will 100% finish. And I never would have anticipated that when you start. So like buddy reads have a way of, if it's with someone that you're comfortable with, have a way of like pushing you towards something that you didn't expect as well, I think, quite often.
Well, we have, I think, a really good system for the Hob buddy reads. Like, and she lends herself well to it because, like, her chapters are fairly consistent. But the way we do it is just like 3 chapters a day, which is generally like somewhere between 60 and 80 pages, depending on the length of the chapters, and then just like talk about it in Boxer. And it's like, it's a pretty good pace because usually like everybody can get to those 3 chapters in a day, but then if they can't, then it's sort of like you can jump ahead or like catch up and you're not too far ahead or behind. And then it's not like an overwhelming amount of messages to listen to necessarily either. And then it keeps us all kind of at the same emotional point.
That is so smart. That is so smart. I'm actually so I've been buddy reading the Border trilogy by Cormac McCarthy with Jimmy for the last couple months, actually. We're in book 2 right now. We're getting close to the end, but we've been doing just a leisurely 10 pages a day and, you know, just chatting about it on Boxer. And it's been like, so for me, McCarthy, especially with his prose, I feel like, I know 10 pages a day sounds like nothing, but there's almost always something to talk about with just 10 pages. And for me, I think like it's helped me to, especially because we did that with Blood Meridian as well in that book. My goodness, that book is dense. And it's amazing. It's an incredible read. But I don't know that I would have, I think it really helped to pace me. So I've never done a paced buddy read like that before until Blood Meridian. And I feel like it was like a life changer for me. So now I'm like all about the paced buddy reads because I think like
Yeah.
that's, I don't know, that's the one thing I've always struggled with buddy reads is like I'm such a slower, I'm much slower reader than most people. So they're just gonna have to wait till I catch up most of the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like it helps you get more out of it too, because like it's almost always true that somebody else's message has something in it that I hadn't thought of, or like I have something to add that somebody else hasn't said, and then we all kind of like make more connections and like have more to say about, you know, the characters and the emotions and everything than we would reading it by ourselves. So I think it's enhanced the experience for sure.
Yeah, and it makes it feel like it's not a race, you know, because that's the one thing that, and I think then it frees up space. Like let's say you finish your 60 pages in Realm of the Elderlings or whatever, it frees up space. So if you want to pick up another book, and let's
Yeah.
say you want to go through that more, then you have the space to do that. So I think that's really cool. And I didn't used to be a multiple books at once person, but this has taught me to do that.
Mhm.
So I really appreciated that as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely a multiple books at once person, but not usually more than 2, and then, like, an audiobook maybe on top of that. If I
Mhm.
start to get more than that, I start to get like, it's not like I have trouble with, balancing what's happening in the books or anything like that, it's more, um, at any given time, I'm like, "Which one do I wanna read?" Like, I don't
Yeah.
know. So it helps to kind of, if I only have 2, it's a little more manageable, like, if I've read some pages of one, then I'll be like, "Okay, I can go to the other one."
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm more or less the same way. Absolutely. Yeah. So I was curious about if you all would be comfortable talking about what it's like to be in a relationship on BookTube. Like, how is that for you two? Because you're a BookTube couple, and I think that's really cool. And it's interesting because like when I do these kinds of why read episodes, I always try to. I do a couple of things. Like sometimes I really actively try to find people who I think have good chemistry together or who I imagine might have good chemistry together. With you two, it's like, I know you two have good chemistry. So that was pretty easy.
Do you want to go
I'd like to
first?
hear about that.
Yeah, I'll go first. It very much takes the tension out of it. Because if I disappear for a while and stop making videos, which I'm very known to do, Grace is still making videos, and so like I can still live vicariously through that. And I would say to say a negative side of it, bullying. Bullying's a big
Bullying.
thing.
Oh, my
My
bullying of you,
yeah,
really?
yeah.
Oh,
My
yeah, yeah.
TBR has been overhauled. Even though I don't have one, my TBR has been very much destroyed by Grace's suggestions in quotation marks. So
But have you liked the books though?
I have liked the books, yeah. But I think we realized that the first time I ever sent Grace books, which is now going on like almost 2 years ago, Grace has not read a single one of those books. She's not read one of them.
Oh,
I was like, you should read these.
Wait, that's
Send
not
them.
technically true
Yeah,
because you sent me a UK edition of The Final Empire, which I have read already. Okay.
yeah.
But the others were The Color of Magic, which well known, not recommended to start with for Terry Pratchett. I will read it at some point though. And then it was Gardens of the Moon and Orlando by Virginia Woolf.
Yeah,
So
to be fair, they're not exactly the best books to
I'll
send.
be getting to Malazan, I promise. I
but
don't have
wasn't
any
there
Orlando though. I could have read
and
that.
wasn't there a book that you gave her that was like book 2 in a series or something?
Oh, that was funny. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That made me
Call of
laugh.
the
I thought
Bone
that was
Ships.
funny.
Sorry.
You were like, because I have the first one too. Yeah. You were like, thanks. You know, I haven't
I
read
was
book 1.
confused.
I love that
Sure,
story.
I still don't know how I managed that, but I think that's
It's a
something.
pretty
I
book.
also, at the same time, I think another book I bought you, you had already you'd indulged and bought yourself it after I ordered it for you, and so another gift I gave her at that point, she'd already bought herself. So that was a
Wait,
poor.
which one was that?
That was The Coward by Stephen.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so now we both have
Oh.
copies of that book.
So
Yeah.
then,
Have you
so I
both
have a
have you
copy of it.
have you guys read that?
No, not yet. No. That
Hmm.
yeah, that's funny. I feel kind of ashamed of myself right now.
That's
Now,
so
now you can
funny.
talk about how great I am, please.
Well,
Your turn.
it's actually funny because when we first started talking, like obviously we kept it private for a while just because it's like obviously it's a weird position personally to be in until like the relationship's on more solid ground. Like we know we're not just like talking to each other romantically or whatever, and we're actually like in a relationship. So it would be weird to kind of go public during that stage. But I do remember like how you were doing like your skits and your comedy and everything, and I just thought you were so cool. And like everybody loves you, which is not
It's true.
surprising at all. And I was kind of like, I feel kind of proud. Like I kind of wish that I could tell people, be like, that's my boyfriend. But after that, it kind of just like is I want to say like mellow and relaxing, like to know that I have someone, I guess, in my corner. Like not that other people aren't, but like I think that we're so constantly supportive of each other, like behind the scenes and like outwardly, that it just takes a lot of the anxiety out of it. And I don't have a lot of anxiety anymore about my channel, but like when we started talking, it was still pretty new, and I think it was really helpful. Like I don't know if you felt the same way, but it was helpful for me.
Yeah, I I think I think I put on an appearance of being quite a like an uncaring person in the sense of like anxiety wise, whereas like I think Grace knows that outside of that I'm a very anxious person. So like one of the reasons that the skits disappeared is because with comedy being so subjective, I was like, what if people don't find this funny? Oh my god, like, and it was very playing on my mind. So then I think like talking to Grace and just being like, I'm just gonna make reviews. Like sometimes it's nice to have someone just go, yeah, like do that. And like like no matter what the idea is, it's like even if it's detrimental or just anything, it's like I'm gonna do this, like take a break, etc. Just someone to say that sounds like you need it is that I found extremely beneficial. So now, like, I don't know, I feel like for a long time I didn't make dedicated reviews because I didn't think I had anything worthwhile to say. I relied on the skits because I thought like that's what people like, etc. And so that shifted, I think, when me and Grace started talking, to be like, I'm just gonna do what makes me not feel terrible inside. So that's what happened. So
I think because we share so much, like, it becomes interesting to see, like, the depth of another person's perspective on having a channel, because I know that you felt that way about, like, your reviews and everything. Meanwhile, I feel like you are always so good at talking about, like, your feelings on a book and, like, illustrating what the, like, feelings were and what the strengths were and everything. Like, but you also, I've seen that growth in you, like, the further you get into school as well. Like, you're kind of armed with more knowledge about, like, literary techniques and everything. Whereas I feel like whenever I talk about a book, it is rambly and doesn't even make any sense. And so I don't know, it's kind of nice to, and then it's also nice to have the feeling of, if I'm telling you, like, oh, I'm overwhelmed or something, you're like, you know that this is supposed to be fun. Like, you don't have to force yourself to read that, like, whatever. Like, even if it's a book I want to read or a book I'm enjoying, like, if I'm just feeling like it's all too much, like, it's nice to have somebody there that can say, like, it's okay, like, you know,
calm down.
yeah.
You don't have to read 500 plus page books a month.
Yeah. I would if I
Yeah.
could, but it's not who I
Yeah.
am.
Yeah, I need that sometimes too. Yeah, totally. Well, I think you both present yourselves beautifully on camera. Ben, I laugh out loud pretty much at every single video. There's always at least one point in your videos where I'm laughing out loud, but I also think that you have incredible insights about the things that you read and things to say. And Grace, I don't think you're rambly at all. I loved, like, in your last wrap up, how you were talking, you were pairing books together. And I thought that was leading to some really interesting discussion points, particularly about the Chernobyl one that you read and this other one that related to science. And I thought that was just such a cool, brilliant way to, like, build connections, because I love that. And I noticed that too, like, sometimes, and I don't really think I do this enough when I'm doing a wrap up, but I don't know if you ever notice this, but I always, like, I'm always, my mind is always kind of like drawn towards looking for patterns or themes. And I sometimes find that I'll read a group of books and I'll be like, wow, these all had, like, a similar theme. Like, like, these had a theme regarding, like, addiction or this or that. I don't know. I always notice things like that. So I just love it, like, if people notice that in their reading or bridge that together. So
I kind of love how you can tell a little bit about how somebody's brain works. Like, I feel like we all kind of find patterns in the things that we read at a certain given time. Like, you just happen to be reading those books at the same time, but then based on what people pick out, you can kind of tell, like, how their brain works.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I always wonder about that too. Absolutely. I think that kind of just goes back to that lineage thing too. So
Yeah.
sometimes I think what you're reading, it could also prime your brain to look for other things. And it's just interesting how that works. Yeah. Well, all three of us have read Beowulf, Philip. I know I
Yes.
reread it thanks to you, Philip. And
I
I
read it
actually
this
want to
week
read.
as well.
Yeah, I actually want to reread it a third time. I have the audiobook, and I don't know if that would work as well, but I'm kind of curious.
I do
Uh,
want to reread it, yeah.
I kind of
yeah.
want to read Tolkien's or Seamus Heaney's
Oh, yeah. Well,
translation.
that's the one I've read. Yeah,
That's the one I
Seamus
read.
Heaney's. Yeah, yeah, that one's really good. I am curious about Tolkien's though. No, that's true. Yeah.
What was I gonna say? Yeah, I feel like when you were talking about the idea of like matching books, um, like sometimes I think whether that is like subconsciously, because of course, like when you buy a book, all the books subconsciously you're aware of at least some kind of description of the book, be it thematically, etc. And whether like you are drawn towards something that has allusions that your like subconscious ties together. And because I'm looking at the books in front of me now, I'm like, there are so many, like, be it ecological, war connections, like they're such separate books, but they have tangential things tied together. And books that I didn't plan to read, after I read a different one, then gets dragged forward, and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't mind picking that up. And it is funny how I think it's why it's good to take a lot of suggestions from elsewhere, because I think as much as it's great to have that where like the books you're reading are tied together, it's also how you get pigeonholed sometimes into like reading the same thing, because it can go to the negative side, if you get what I mean. That if you don't have a kind of plethora to draw from, you're like, okay, well, this reminds me of this, and you kind of like, oh, this is what I'm going to stick with, and you become hyper focused. Whereas like if I'm like, oh, I'm reading a World War One like novel, and then I kind of want to read this. Like I read one of the Women's Prize books, and it was about the Bosnia in 1990s, and it's like, so they're all to do with war, but they all kind of draw from different places, and then fantasy, of course, all full of war.
Yeah,
you can't really get away from it.
This is true.
That's so funny, because I was thinking about that with the Mercedes Lackey one. I'm like, it doesn't really have war or battle scenes. I don't know. It does have conflict. It does have conflict. It does have conspiracy, but it doesn't have like the bloodshed that I feel like, I don't know. And I'm like, I know it does seem like now that I think about it, that is something I read a lot of.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the like kind of darker, grittier fantasy worlds, they have that, right? Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, like, coming from like, because I've had an idea for the book I want to write in terms of the fantasy one, and one of the big things I had to come to terms with is that I don't want to write about a war, and I don't want to write about fighting. And it was only after reading the Long Price Quartet that I was like, one of the most underrated and ignored series of all time. I'm like, that's what I want to write. Like the one that
I still haven't read it.
Oh yeah,
I
won't say. I won't be.
It's on my shelf. It's on the TBR for this year. I'm gonna be buddy reading it with the, I don't know if you all know.
You have that good copy, that bind up. I can see it.
I do. Yeah, Evie gave it to me. Santa, BookTube Santa gave it to me. So
yeah, I got that one as well. I was so lucky to find it, because it's like, well, the rest of them, the editions are so inconsistent, right? Like in terms of size and style and everything.
Yeah. I'm hoping to start it. I think I'm planning this summer to start that, but I will be starting that eventually this year.
I have a feeling that you're really gonna like that one.
I know, and then that means Jimmy will probably like it too, I'm sure. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with me that I haven't read it yet. I wanted to for some time, but I have a strong feeling I'll love it.
It happens to the best of us.
We've had, I think we tentatively talked about rereading it this year.
Yeah.
Like after the Song of Ice and Fire read along, doing one.
Yeah.
Because they're so short is the good thing about it. Like I think they're probably like 300 pages each for LPQ.
It's something like that, yeah, because the entire bind up is, well, actually, it might even be less than that, because I believe my entire bind up is around 1,000 pages, maybe 1,100. So that's an average of less than 300 pages a book.
Yeah.
Because people are talking about Earthsea, I just bought this.
Ooh, I have a big old one too.
It has that same artwork as like the other big bind up, and it has a couple of essays. Yeah, it's the same thing, but it's smaller, I think.
Okay. Yeah, this is massive.
Yeah. And it has a couple of essays of hers too, which is kind of neat. And it has a lot of stuff in it. Yeah, it's really pretty. So that is something I would like to get to eventually.
I saw that I think that they've just released a new bind up of essays by Le Guin. I think it's called like Space Crone or something. Let me have a look.
Did we look at that together, or is that a different one?
No, that was because I found an audio. Oh yeah, it's called Space Crone. It's like this all purple cover, and then it has just Ursula K. Le Guin and then in white, and then Space Crone in black. And it's meant to be her collected essays, and that's one I keep on seeing and being like, I think I need to read more of Le Guin to actually get something from it, or like more from it, if you get what I mean. Because Left Hand of Darkness is one I want to get to this year, like desperately.
The Dispossessed is what I'm going to start with. So
I have The Dispossessed at my parents, because what I've done is I've started allocating books to different houses. So if I'm there, I'm like, I can just pick up a book, and so I know I've got The Dispossessed at my parents. I've got Left Hand of Darkness here, and then if I go to see Grace, I can read Wizard of Earthsea. So I'm creating a rotation.
Would you say you were dispossessed of it?
I wasn't.
Yeah, that's one I definitely want to get to. Yeah, I would definitely be interested in the essay collection, because I know I'm always hearing about her famous, I cannot remember the name of the essay now. Philip could probably put it in the chat, but the one about world building and prose, I really want to read it, and I'm so ashamed I haven't. But I think part of the issue is, like, when it comes to essays, like, I spend so much time on a computer screen every day that I would rather have a print copy of essays if possible, or even an ebook copy. But to read it on a screen is always like, I don't know. It just takes.
Is it not printed by itself?
Not that I couldn't find it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Philip. That's what it is.
Well, maybe I'll see after this. I'll see whether it's in that Space Crone edition.
Oh, that would be cool. Yeah. Let me know. I'll look it up too. So this particular essay, I feel like I already could tell you what the essay is about, though, because I've watched Philip talk about it so many times. But the idea is that, like, you cannot separate world building from prose, and a lot of people who talk about, and I think it's a really interesting take that contrasts a lot of what Sanderson talks about with the clear glass prose style, where you're trying not to have any style in your prose so that you have the focus just on the story itself. But she's trying to make an argument, I guess, that it's actually through the prose that you create the world. So I don't know. It sounds so cool, and I really want to read it.
I think I would lean more towards that side of things. Like, I do understand the value in having, like, some sort of a transparent prose style, but I feel like the authors that do that I enjoy the most still have, like, really good prose and, like, really good and, like, impactful word choice. It's just that it's not flowery. So it's not as though the prose isn't good. Like, they're still very, very intentional about, like, the words they're choosing and what they're crafting, but they're not going over the top where, like, your attention is on their sentence structure or their writing structure or anything. But I don't know, the prose is still doing a lot of the heavy lifting, in my opinion. It just fades into the background a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't think she's necessarily, I mean, I could be wrong, and I know it's online. I guess because it's short, then maybe I will read it online. That's probably the reason I've been, like, hesitant, because I'm like, if it's a long essay, I hate reading long. Like that Wired article everybody was talking about a few weeks ago. I'm like, I just can't be bothered. I cannot but be bothered to read a long online article. Whether it's positive or negative, I just won't do it. But yeah, as far as, like, her particular stance on that, I don't know that she would necessarily say that it has to be flowery. I think that's different. I think it's more just I think she has examples, though, in the essay, though, to illustrate how fantasy world building is actually accomplished through the prose. So yeah. I don't know. We'll have to read it. Like, maybe we should read it, talk about it.
Maybe we should. It sounds like Abercrombie personified, like the idea of prose helping with world building, because he's definitely the one that I'm like, okay, I know what the world is because of how he writes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that people talk about flowery prose, but I think that you can go about, if you did just the window glass way of prose. This is an extreme example, and I'm not saying that any author does this necessarily, but I would think that it would take a lot more description of things to illustrate the world, to describe the world, than if you used certain types of adjectives along the way, or certain types of subtle descriptions along the way to sort of paint the picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I think it sounds like an interesting topic. I would definitely need to read the article to be more informed, but I know that Philip did a fantastic video about this particular essay.
No, it does sound really interesting. I didn't even know about it. I want to read it now.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read any Le Guin yet, so I probably couldn't comment on whether her prose is purple or not. It sounds but I don't think that necessarily good prose is necessarily purple, or and I guess I always wonder uh how people are defining that term too. How they define the word purple prose.
Yeah, there's kind of a blurry
Yeah.
line. Like, I would say that most of the prose that I like is not overly purple or flowery, but that doesn't mean that I don't like it when it is, just that I find it a little bit more, slow to read, and, the comment that just came up about Greenbone is sort of what I was saying in my review of Untethered Sky, because I feel like Fonda Lee really has that quality that she's really good at this. Um, I don't even know what I was saying, sorry.
I think
Mm.
we've talked about like Daniel Abraham and Long Price Quartet in that same
Yeah.
vein of like knowing how to hyper specify, like not necessarily um, having to be purple or anything, just using specific words or phrases that really like it just embodies. You can extrapolate on what they're saying based on a phrase, and you
Hmm.
fill in that world building yourself rather than
Yeah.
having to have something hyper fixated on. Um,
Maybe it's the skill of the author, like, their vocabulary, because, like, there are so many words that mean similar things, but if they wanna illustrate for you, like, exactly what they mean, then they have to choose the right word, right?
Yeah, that's how I would think. That's what I would think as well. That's what I would imagine as well. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I think that there's a case for different types of ways of writing or approaching writing in order to gain certain. I guess it's just really what the effect that the author is going for. That's really what it boils down to, and whether they are able to achieve that. Have you all read any Guy Gavriel Kay?
No, I haven't, but he's Canadian, so I want to.
Ah, yeah. That's an author I want to prioritize getting to this year. I'm going to be starting with, oh man, The Lions of Alrasan, I think is the one that Jake Bishop recommends starting with. But I imagine I'm going to love his prose because I have picked up, I was in a used bookstore one day and I picked up various books on the shelf by him. And I read just like the first paragraph of several of his books. And I thought, my goodness, I just loved the way he described things, like the way he wrote. There was just such a flow to it. There's so many different ways to, I think, understand prose and writing. Is there anything that you've learned about when it comes to prose in your studies, Ben, that has kind of elucidated how you think about prose or what you gravitate
uh,
towards?
yeah, it's in my opinion, it's so individual. Like the idea of like prose is almost intangible. Um, and like I think people like to really get into prose even, and I do. Like I always talk about the actual writing style, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, but it's also so it's probably the most subjective form of the writing. Like when you look at world building, you're like, okay, well, this person's drawing from here, etc. Like other things are a bit more concrete, whereas prose is just it's a bashing together of different styles and different people that you've appreciated, whether you're focusing on the language side of things or a literature point of view, all of the different avenues that you can draw from. It just makes prose impossible to fully describe. Like I know people hate "This Is How We Lose the Time" more because they hate the purple prose, whereas because I don't visually imagine things, I just read on a sentence level. All of the writing is so beautiful that I don't care that I can't imagine it because I never do. And so like it's just prose is an ethereal mistress.
It's kind
Yeah.
of
Oh, I
like
love that. That's a beautiful way to say that. It's an ethereal mistress.
because even
Um,
though, like, it's kind of impossible to pin down, but it's also impossible to separate from the rest of the story, right? Because it's literally the vessel through which you're experiencing the story. So
yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that that's exactly right. I think that's exactly what Le Guin is trying to say in that essay, from what I understand, which I still need to read. So I probably shouldn't even say what she's trying to say until I read the essay. Just from what I've heard, I always feel like I'm parroting Philip. Poor Philip.
Philip is
I
very
feel like
smart, so
Yeah, he is.
no,
He is. I'm like, if
absolutely.
I
He's gonna
just
parrot
parrot Philip,
anyone.
I'll sound smart. Just kidding. Just kidding. No, but I
I
do
feel like
love books. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
also, I was just gonna say that I feel like whenever someone says that they're like, I don't know why, but this book just didn't vibe with me. It almost always comes down to the writing style, and it's just that because it's intangible, you can't quite describe what doesn't work about it. But it usually I find falls that it's something about the writing style that when they explain it, they're like, oh no, this actually something about the way they. I think it's I don't want to dob you in on your current thoughts, but there's a book you're currently reading, Grace, that I think the writing
Oh,
style is
yeah.
actively acting. Um,
Yeah,
and I
that's
think a lot
true.
of people have that.
Hmm.
I'll be making a video about it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch that. Yeah, I think for me, like what I always say is that, or what I've kind of, the way I've kind of boiled down what I look for when it comes to having a really good reading experience are three basic things. I think it's like three basic things a lot of people are looking for, honestly, but it's to feel things, to feel emotions, it's to feel immersed. And so immersion can happen through a sense of atmosphere or the settings. And I am a visual reader, so I do visualize things like crazy. I like to feel like I am not here. I am in the book. Like, or there is no book. There is no Joanna. I'm just in the story. That's a better way to put it. So that could even happen sometimes to me, honestly, even through audiobooks sometimes, if I'm having a really good reading experience. And so those two things, immersion, feeling something, and then the third thing I would say is a sense of wonder. So a sense of wonder is like that lingering sense of like intrigue or questioning, or even just like beauty or essence that is left hovering over me after a story. So those are three things I look for in a story. And for me, the prose does a huge, I think it's an important vehicle to give me that experience, to transport me, to build that sense of immersion, to build the sense of tone, the feeling of the atmosphere, the feeling of the setting. So it's one thing to be able to describe a setting, but to actually feel it, or to for me to imagine it, and like what how that contrasts, how that either contrasts what the character is experiencing, or how it's congruent with what the character is experiencing. I love both. I love seeing both. So like for example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, there are many times, like for example at the end of book 3, there was a specific setting where the way that the weather was described, I don't want to say too much, and the way that the setting was described, everything about the setting was so beautiful. And it just perfectly encapsulated a certain quality of this character that we're following. And at the same time, it then starkly contrasted. I didn't mean to say use the word stark.
I was
No
gonna
pun
say,
intended. No pun intended.
like a
But
Freudian.
subconscious pun intended. But like it very much contrasted then what happened to the character in that scene. And I feel like that's all accomplished through the prose. And it was just beautiful. It flowed. It had a sense of flow to it, but it had a sense of tone to it. So there was emotion there. There was description there. There was specific word choice there. So I guess for me, it is a very important thing. And then character voice too. So I feel like I could just go on forever about how I do feel like prose does serve an important purpose in like my experience of a story. And somebody, or that author, Martin, could have written that story the same exact way, took out a lot of the color in the description, took out some of those adjectives, and it wouldn't have probably had the same effect. And I think that's why it's so hard to talk about prose, is that we don't get to see the contrast. If we're reading a Robin Hobb passage, we never get to see the contrast of what it looked like without her style in it. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
like, let's say we saw a first draft of it just being like vomit on paper, kind of, so to speak, versus the polished, edited draft. We never get to see that contrast. So it's hard for us to assess these things.
That's a
I think.
fantastic description.
Oh, sorry.
That's all I was saying.
Ah, I was going to say that I feel like one thing that I do love is, for instance, talking about Hobb and then George R. R. Martin, is it's there seems like there's sometimes, because they know each other, they've evidently like that there's plenty of conversations between the two of them. Sometimes there's a lot of dialogue of their ideas between each other, I think, and they have a lot of magical ideas that are very similar in both series, but they approach them in very different ways. And I think I did the same with what was it? I read LPQ actually, and then I read Ted Chiang. And at the
Yeah.
back of Ted Chiang, he has in his acknowledgements, he has Daniel Abraham in the acknowledgements. And when I was reading the Ted Chiang story, I was like, this feels so much like an LPQ, like if I had the idea but did a different thing. And then seeing his name at the end, you're like, did they have like a conversation of these two people approaching the same idea differently? And I love finding those connections a lot. Like when you read two books and then you find out the authors are friends and you've put together and you're like, there's something going on here. And
You're
then
like,
you
I
find
noticed it.
yeah,
That's so neat.
I think that's one of the best feelings.
I love that. I love that too. And somebody asked to answer this question. I'm doing this based on Jake Bishop's recommendation. He is like the go-to person, at least in this corner of BookTube, when it comes to Guy Gavriel Kay. And this is where he recommends starting. I do own Tigana, so I do plan to get to that. But I think I'm going to be planning to start with Lions of Al-Rasan. And Jimmy did say that he loved Lions of Al-Rasan too. So I'm really looking forward to that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a little behind on the chat here. Looks like we have, let's see, purple prose used to be a compliment. Yeah, I know that's an interesting insight there. I find it interesting and a bit sad that many people seem to think of it as a negative thing now. That makes me sad too, Philip. That's a really good point. I don't even know, and I think that's what I mean by I don't really know what people mean anymore when they say purple prose, because so many people are meaning it almost as a criticism. And I tend to love, I guess I love prose that other people might not consider to their taste as far as that's concerned. Genuinely curious why it is called purple prose. Yeah. That's a funny question.
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know the answer to that either. Yeah.
I think for me, it all comes down to like purple or flowery prose for me isn't like a criticism. A lot of the times it is a compliment because it means like beautiful writing to me, but at the same time, and we're just talking about how prose is so intangible, right? It comes down to the author's flow, because if the author is doing a lot with their prose, for me, it's like if it flows, then it's great. Like I will enjoy it just the same. But if it doesn't flow well for me for whatever reason, then I'll probably find it like dense or more difficult to get through, or just like a slower read. And then maybe then in that sense, like for me, it will become a criticism of the book, but not necessarily like a criticism of a more intricate type of writing style. Like it's like we said, it's so hard to pin down because it can be both, just depending on whether it works for my brain or not.
And what the author is going for. And, one of my favorite authors right now, I think it's safe to say, is just based on my experiences recently, is Cormac McCarthy. And he alternates. So like sometimes he has very, very sparse prose, especially with the dialogue. And then sometimes he just has like these crazy run-on sentence paragraphs and uses like these archaic words, and it feels very biblical and rich, and I live for it and I love it. I love both, but I think both have the effect. They both have their own effect. And even the contrast has an effect in itself. So I just think it's cool to be able to like be flexible with our understanding and not be too rigid about like, oh, I only like purple prose, or I only like crystal clear prose. but just to understand there are different aesthetics. And, it's kind of like appreciating an impressionistic painting versus, a Van Gogh painting, or appreciating a naturalistic painting, so to speak. So different styles, I guess. Well, you guys, I need to go ahead and get going, unfortunately. So I'm sorry to end this now, because I've really enjoyed my time talking with both of you. I always enjoy talking to you too.
It's okay.
And
I need to go back to sleep. So
yeah, you probably do. I'm sure. So I just want to thank you both so much for joining me today. This was so much fun.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank you
much
for
for
having
having
me.
us. This was
Yeah.
a fantastic discussion. So I'm sorry, Ben, I just talked over you.
Oh no, we spoke at the same time. I think we said the exact same things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanna.
Hey, it was my pleasure. And thank you, everyone in the chat, for joining us today and creating another wonderful special episode of Why Read. Appreciate you all so, so much. And I hope you all are enjoying whatever you're reading right now. So thanks again so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.